talk a little bit about a couple of the themes that I've been looking into specifically while being at the BRICS Policy Center. One of the big themes that a lot of people seem to be looking at specifically is the increasing interest of the BRICS countries on the African continent in terms of trade, investment, and in some cases aid policies. What is really interesting now, particularly in the current financial situation, is that the African continent is one of the areas where return on investment is really relatively high because of the higher growth rates that African countries are experiencing relative to the other developed economies. And as a result, BRICS countries are looking at Africa not just in terms of natural resources, because this is a theme that is emphasized all the time, but increasingly as a market. If you look at the African continent, you have a market of almost 1 billion people, and increasingly the BRICS countries are looking for ways to internationalize their national companies, whether it's in construction, in mining, in telecommunications. And African countries are really fertile territory for trying to find greenfield investments here, because the markets are so open and because there is such a demand for these kinds of goods and services. And so what we've been seeing, a lot of my research is focused specifically on what China's doing in Africa, but a lot of developments have happened in tandem with the other BRICS countries. There's a lot of energy being invested in increasing political engagements in order to extend various kinds of financing, especially bilateral financing through government-to-government credit lines. We've seen this with China, with the China Export-Import Bank, the China Development Bank, and various other state-owned policy banks. And this has been mirrored by India's lesser but still important activity with the China Export-Import Bank. We have Brazil's National Bank of Social and Economic Development, as well as South Africa, which through the Industrial Development Corporation, but now increasingly looking at a specific agency that will look more specifically in developing projects to promote development in Africa. So all these things are happening at around the same time, and a lot of the focus is on infrastructure. I think partly because infrastructure projects per se were ignored by the World Bank and the IMF for quite a period, because they were considered to be white elephant projects, but also because a lot of the key competencies of the BRICS countries lies in infrastructure and construction projects. So if you have a situation whereby your export credit agency from your country is extending these credit lines, it's essentially easy money to promote the export of your goods and services. So the goods and services coming from your country, which opens up market space for these goods and services behind this credit line, and also opens up an opportunity for these companies coming from the BRICS countries and into African economies to have an opportunity to engage into projects, because these tenders and these projects will generally be reserved for the companies from which the export credits are coming. Now obviously this is not just the BRICS countries that are doing this. You've got Portugal, Germany, the US, and various other countries are also doing this. But what is noticeable is the speed which with the BRICS countries have been using this kind of mechanism to enter into African markets, and also their relative success. Another theme that I look at increasingly in my research is the concept of African agency. A lot of the times when we're engaging in research, whether it be China-Africa research of the BRICS countries into Africa, it's always from the perspective of what is China doing in Africa? How are the BRICS countries pushing forward their agenda? And very little is looked at in terms of what is it that the African countries are doing in response to these movements? How are they creating policy space to respond to these political overtures, but also to create policy themselves and proactively shape their international relations. And I think this comes from an assumption from many analyses that African countries are just seen as the passive actor or the passive part of this relationship. And that's really not necessarily the case if you look at these relations. African political elites have been given a unique space once again within their international relations. We saw during the Cold War, African governments were particularly skillful in playing off the United States with the Soviet Union in terms of trying to get resources, support, development aid, arms from whichever side by pledging their supposed allegiance to one side or the other in the Cold War. Now we have a situation where, again, African political elites have a renewed policy space, but it's not in a bipolar world anymore, but in a multipolar world. So originally, there was this idea of African countries playing off their support from Western countries, so their previous colonial relations, the European Union, sometimes the US, with China, which was seen as this new alternative source of funding, trade, investment, that didn't play along the rules with the OECD countries. But increasingly, we have a whole matrix of international relations whereby you see it's not just China that's not necessarily following the tune of the OECD, but again, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Malaysia, Mexico, Indonesia, all of these emerging countries which are also looking to increase their international commercial relations. And often this is under the banner of South-South cooperation, and it's great to use this as a kind of cushion of political rhetoric. But fundamentally, it's about increasing commercial relations and increasing your commercial footprint on the rest of the world. And now African countries have a space with which they can pick and choose rather than being locked into the kind of north-south trade and investment corridors that we saw were in place for the better part of the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is incredibly interesting. What remains to be seen, however, is what African political elites are going to do with this space. Because as we've seen in a country, for instance, like Angola, which is in a post-conflict situation, you have a lot of reinvestment that needs to occur in terms of the reconstruction of the infrastructure, of institutions, that you have a lot of investment going into that country. And that government has it, particularly because it's so forcefully consolidated, it's been in power for over 30 years, they have a space with which to essentially renew and create a renaissance in that country. But the question is how much of the resources and how much of this political and commercial interest that is coming into Angola is going to be used for the fundamental growth of the country, and how much is going to be used to further the individual political and economic agendas of the political elites in power. A last theme, which is possibly a little bit premature because there's still a lot to be seen in terms of how this is going to develop, but is the idea of competition and collaboration amongst the BRICS countries. You have this group of countries that were firstly grouped together by Goldman Sachs, and secondly took the initiative to form a grouping themselves because they are emerging countries with all this potential, have huge populations, and an increasing role on political and economic stages in global fora. But fundamentally, what do they have in common, and how are they actually going to create institutions through which they can actually see eye to eye and participate? It's very rare for the countries that make up the BRICS group to actually agree on a certain position. And if we look at this from the perspective of what the BRICS countries are doing in Africa, they have pledged to support various political positions on various on various areas. We've seen Syria, Iran, and I'm sure that this will be extended to various happenings in Africa as the case arises. But in terms of what, if we look at the New Delhi Declaration and what is inside that document, and although the themes of solidarity and collaboration are very strong there, if you look at the individual activities of these BRICS countries in Africa, particularly, but obviously in the rest of the world, they seem to be somewhat in contrast with the stated collective priorities of the BRICS grouping. And in order for the BRICS grouping to be taken seriously, and in order for it to actually put forward an agenda that can be acted upon, that can be taken seriously with the rest of the world, they will have to resolve these inattentions between the priorities of the group per se and the individual priorities of the different members. And we can see this again in terms of the New Delhi Declaration, where the idea of a BRICS development bank was put forward. Now, they've been very cautious about this. Instead of actually launching it, they're going to have a study group, and the finance ministers are going to look into the feasibility of this. But the question is, how will this development bank, the proposed idea of this development bank, how will that be reconciled with the individual activities of, say, for instance, the Exim banks of these countries, the development banks of these countries? Is this going to be a complementary activity, or is it going to be actually in competition with the individual priorities of these countries? We've already seen there's been some tension or some veiled antagonism between Chinese companies and the financing that they bring to various African markets. And for instance, South African companies or Brazilian companies in various markets, officially they will always say, oh, these markets are big enough for everybody, there's lots and lots of work here for us to do, we have specific relations with various countries, our footprints are not the same, and there's more than enough to go around in terms of African markets. But there is an undercurrent of tension in terms of, particularly on the South African side, South African construction companies have withdrawn in some cases from African markets completely because they can no longer compete with their Chinese counterparts. Now, in terms of trying to reconcile this kind of phenomenon with collaboration on a high political level within the BRICS grouping, it's going to be very interesting to see how these two situations are reconciled. And I think this is one of the aspects that the group of finance ministers that are doing the research for this bank are going to have to consider very seriously.